we're going to welcome Danny Gomez to the show to talk about our next Net Zero Carbon segment sponsored by Link. So Danny, thank you for joining us. Continuing some of the conversation that we had with John Gallagher this morning about that Inflation Reduction Act and specifically the climate initiatives that are packed into it. We started off talking to John about the EV segment and how the tax incentives might not even come close to paying for the cost of these electric vehicles.
Yeah, there's I think the multiples of, you hear hundreds of $1,000s or more for an EV truck, and I think the incentive is $40,000. So there's definitely a gap there. It sends a signal to the market. We always talk about that it starts to incent and starts to change people's posture a little bit. So that's, I think, generally good. I think we know legislation is usually not perfect. So hopefully it does at least start to move people again in the right direction. One interesting thing that you guys talked about this morning, which is also is something that was mentioned on the segment we did last Friday for the Net Zero Carbon show and podcast, was around really the true emissions around EV and, are these truly net zero? Alyssa Spohr has written an article about this as well from FreightWaves. And in this segment we did last week, it was talking about what is the generation mix, right? Everyone talks about tailpipe emissions. So that's definitely on an EV car or truck, there's no tailpipe emissions. But then you look at the full life cycle and think about the generation that went into producing the power that charged the battery that ran the truck. And then you start thinking about, okay, well, how was that power generated? And so I know you guys were talking about this this morning, and, it really started to connect the pieces in what we were talking about on our show last week. And the example that Nate Springer from G&A gave was, look, doing an EV truck in West Virginia is much different than doing an EV truck in California, because the generation mix in those regions are just very different. And so I think one of the things that we often talk about here is how nuanced everything is, right? Like, you can make these very general statements. EV is taking, has a lot of headline appeal, right? And I think it's getting worked into a lot of the legislation, and I'm sure that there is backroom conversations are happening to push these things forward. John also mentioned something about the fuel aspect of, and how it seemed like while there's a strong push for EV, there's also needs to be a push for alternative fuels, and that didn't feel very balanced out in the bill. And so I think there's a lot to unpack there. And I think, to drill down on EV is important, because to understand that it's not a silver bullet, and there still needs to be a lot of work on the renewable energy side of things. I think right now, coal is just above, I think it's like 21.8% of the U.S. generation mix, whereas renewables are around 21%, and then that varies by state, like I said before. So, pretty interesting things to think about.
Danny, one of those really nuanced conversations that we have to have involves something that's directly written into the bill. And it's that to qualify for these tax incentives and these credits, that a certain amount of the raw materials for these EVs and the EV batteries specifically have to be sourced from the United States, that America First idea, supporting American jobs, the American economy. How feasible is it to actually require that amount of sourcing from raw materials from here, with how much outsourcing we do already for all of our battery production? Most of our battery production, of course, comes from materials that are sourced and created in Asia and then brought back over to the United States. So is that feasible? And then can you touch a little bit on the environmental impact that comes from raw material sourcing for batteries anyways?
I don't know if this was the intent, but hopefully this is the impact, where it pushes us toward more supporting battery recycling and recycling of the batteries. There's a gentleman, his name escapes me. He was early leader in Tesla. He spun off or started his own company, which is very focused on recycling batteries. Everything that they're doing here is in the U.S., that they're creating these facilities. I think one of the big ones is in North Carolina. It does two things, right? It helps with that onshoring component. It helps with the footprint of the batteries, because when you look at the starting point, you take a internal combustion engine truck off the line and you take an EV truck off the line, the EV truck off the line has a higher footprint associated with it because of the mining and the production of the batteries associated with it. Over the course of operating, when you have zero tailpipe emissions, then the internal combustion engine quickly catches up, and then over time exceeds the emissions, the full life cycle emissions. So if you are able to work on the front end and lower the starting point for the footprint of the EV vehicles, and you can do that through recycling batteries, that is a win-win, right? You're doing both things. You're reducing the footprint and you're helping create jobs here locally. And it becomes this circularness to EV. When you start to think about that, we're really getting into some interesting conversations where we're not so much relying on external inputs from raw materials. EVs can start to help support themselves. Then you start thinking about the solar aspect of it, or the wind, or the renewable energy aspect, and then you really start to see where this can go. And I think that's the people who are really passionate about it have that line of sight.
Yeah, we've got to drive this technology forward, and it's not going to be perfect as we move forward. We've got to have that initial push and drive the technology so that it does become perfect after a while. Because you're exactly right. It's really not. The production of the battery is worse for the environment than an internal combustion. Then you got to talk about how do you generate that charge to charge that battery, and then what do you do with it afterwards? And even recycling batteries, while it keeps it out of the ground, that energy spent is not green either. So you got to consider all that type of stuff. My question to you is really, we're trying to drive all these initiatives and alternative fuels, et cetera. Why was this packed into an inflationary budget? It doesn't seem like it reduces inflation at all. I mean, even giving just take the case of Ford pickups on the non-commercial side. Well, I guess they are used commercially as well, but $7,500 tax incentive, but they raised the price $8,500 because of getting the batteries, right? So you lost $1,000 like overnight right there with this legislation.
Yeah, I'm no policy expert, but your guess is as good as mine in terms of, I mean, it's standard operating, right? Like, let's slip it in. It's packed, it's the American people can get behind a Inflation Reduction bill, right? Everyone's hurting. So
I agree, but it doesn't seem like they did anything for that. But definitely the net zero and the drive towards green is certainly there. What about the alternative fuels? You said it didn't seem like it was balanced quite correctly, right? Does it seem like the legislation or this particular piece of legislation is banking more on EV than anything else? Because there are those that'll say EV is not the solution.
Yeah, I haven't read every single word, but just anecdotally, it feels like the comments that we're picking up on that it is more EV slanted. But that's it's just been par for the course, right? Generally speaking, a lot of the legislation has been pushing towards EV, which is interesting because you talk to people who are experts in the field, in transportation specifically, and long haul specifically, and they say EV is not the lowest hanging fruit, right? Renewable fuels, renewable diesel, biodiesel, those are the types of things that can immediately be implemented and can help our industry now. And so it's definitely good to fund the medium long term, but we do need to be doing stuff now as well.
Absolutely, Danny. You said it best when we started. It's about the EVs making the flashy headlines, but there's a ton of nuance to this discussion as well. As far as the next Net Zero Carbon Show, can you give us a little sneak peek about what's coming up next?
Yeah, so this whole segment is focused on non-tailpipe emissions, but also kind of like the real estate that supports the industry and how those two things interplay. And so we spent last episode talking about understanding what scopes are and really digging into renewable energy and how firms running big distribution centers can think about sourcing that energy and what it means as we do see a pickup in EV, whether it's local delivery, last mile, medium range deliveries, and how firms like Link Logistics can enable their customers to meet those demands and prepare them for a more sustainable generation mix. And so that's interesting. So we're trying to dig in on the next episode on what that actually looks like. When you're going to source renewable energy, how do you go about signing up those virtual PPAs? and making sure that the generation stack that supports the power demands of the near term are cleaner.
Excellent stuff, Danny. We look forward to that and our talk with you again next week. You have a wonderful rest of your day today, my friend.
You too. Thanks.
All right. And of course, you can catch those episodes of Net Zero Carbon on tv.freightwaves.com if you miss them live on Fridays. Right now, we're going to take one final break, then we'll be back to wrap up your show.